The more we become objectively focused and reductive scientifically oriented in our thinking and our cosmology, what have you, it gives us great precision, but at the cost of a kind of aliveness. I'm very interested in the use of language and communication more broadly for these kind of states of animation, because I think that's really what the enchanted world was and is about, what makes things come alive. Otherwise, we have a lot of ghosts on our hands.
All right, welcome to the Beyond Listening podcast. We have today with us Dr. Joseph Cambray, who we're going to call Joe from this point on. Joe just completed a long and very impactful tenure as the president and CEO of Pacifica University technically it's in Montecito, California, Santa
Um,
Barbara.
it's Pacifica Graduate Institute has two campuses. They're both formally in Carpinteria. They're right on the
Carpenter,
border of Montecito.
Southern California, or
Yeah,
Central California, depending on how Californian
yeah,
you are.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and we were introduced to you, Joe, through a course that you were leading online. We've been dabblers at Pacifica teaching. We taught a few council trainings
Yes.
when Miriam and I were working together in another context. Did and have done these online or the short courses, and sort of getting a taste of Pacifica without diving in completely. So which is a great resource for folks. But we tuned into your course called Fielding the Unconscious: Origins and Evolution of Field Theory. And we've heard a lot about field theory. We talk about relational field of organizations, of groups. And it was a real opportunity to dive into the history um, and the Jungian context of field theory and where this all originates from. And it far exceeded our expectations, and they were pretty high to begin with, in terms of the depth and breadth, and um, also a key word here, which for us was enchantment and re-enchantment.
Mm.
And we thought we really want to talk to you more about all of this and share what you were sharing with in that course with our audience. So thank you so much for being here with us.
No, it's my pleasure. Where would you like to start?
Let's start with your story as the way in. So you're a
Mm.
you're a
Okay.
Jungian analyst, professor, president, and CEO. Obviously, that's a
Yeah.
long and big
Hmm.
career. So curious
Yeah.
how you kind of found yourself on that path in life, and when that started for you.
Well, yeah, there are several different ways to look at that. The earliest uh, aspect of it, I guess, was in childhood. Um, when I was about 7, 8 years old, I developed an illness, a blood illness that was mysterious and unknown. And it caused me to have to limit the amount of physical activity I did for a couple of years. And it brought me into reading. And what I read just on my own intuition and desire was world myth. I spent much of the time, and I say that was training as a child analyst back in that period. But what happened was I was a child of the Sputnik era, and I went into science first. I have a doctorate in chemistry from Berkeley, and mostly in quantum mechanics applied to into small chemical systems. And then I postdoced at Stanford for a while. Went to Japan, um, where I did a couple of years as a visiting professor at Osaka University. And while I was there, that was still in the Department of Chemistry. While I was there, I found a Zen meditation group in Kyoto, about 45-minute train ride from where I lived in Osaka. And it was a bilingual group, which helped enormously. And I began to do Zazen with with the group there, and it was very psychoactive. I suddenly had a whole series of really what I would call enchanting dreams, and they were really a turning point for me. I had already interest in psychology. I studied psychology in my undergraduate, and this influx of dreams was extremely relevant and important to questions of life direction and so forth. And I discussed it a bit with the Zen teachers, but they said, yes, yes, that happens. Don't worry, it'll go away. And I said, well, all right. I'm willing to let go of it, but I'd like to have some sense of what it is I'm experiencing because it seems pretty monumental. And again, their attitude was somewhat dismissive, but I went to the university library in Osaka, and they had Jung in the library. So I began to read Jung on dreams in a much more serious kind of way. So the Zen people were, as is part of their tradition, they saw this as a phenomena that was part of what gets unleashed in the meditative activity, but they felt that that wasn't really the goal and that would be a distraction. And I was willing to entertain that possibility, but at the same time, I also knew enough about psychology to say these dreams are highly personally relevant, and I'm looking for some orientation and direction. And so I began to study them more seriously on my own. I did a number of things while I remained in Japan, but it wasn't until I returned to the U.S. That I really was started to pursue a potential career change, and it went via several routes. I returned to California because I left from California, and I returned here. Then ended up in Dallas with James Hillman and the group around him for a while, and that led me into analytic training, and from there, I was up in the Boston area and I finished my training there. And as that career began to unfold, I got involved in becoming the editor of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, running some conferences for them that were sort of comparative analysis conferences. And that in turn opened up being invited to be the honorary secretary of the International uh, Analytic Association, the IAP, and ultimately I ended up going through a presidency there. And as I was finishing the presidency, Pacifica contacted me about a potential position, and we decided I'd come out as provost. And so I came here as provost for a couple of years, and in the middle of that I became interim president, and then was invited to be president, and I've just retired from it now. So that's a quick,
So
short thumbnail.
yeah, I noticed how you sped up near the end there, and there's these
Okay.
two big transition points. There's the one that you
Hmm.
just I'm just in hearing your story now.
Sure.
Um, there's that
Yeah, please.
transition that you just made and are making, and we get to meet you at this moment. And then there was the one where you were inspired by dreams to,
Hmm.
let me tell me if I'm wrong in using this word, to radically change your life and your
Yes.
orientation. Um, and that one really stands out for me because there's so many people that we work with or that,
Hmm.
and we've gone through these transitions too, that make those big leaps and have been inspired by something that, in this context, the one that you shared, the everyone around you was saying, "Oh, don't focus on that," in the Zen context, and you kind of had to tread your own, create your own path. And I'm curious about what,
Yes.
in recalling that now, how that was for you, and the challenges or the, yeah, how you make meaning of that now, that transition that you made, and the dream inspiration of it, if that feels important to share.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The dreams really were, and I can see them in some of my thoughts. I mean, some of the dreams had to do with what I would call the adjacent possible. That I started dreaming of finding new rooms in the house that I lived in, and one in particular had an old. It was an old Japanese style room because I was living in Japan with one of the central kotatsu, the heating for the winter and so forth, a kind of fire pit in the center of the room. And I realized that this was a central fire, and that, I mean, I had some senses of dream symbolisms, so I realized this was a very key thing that I was finding through Zen, but also through the world of dreams. And keeping the tension between those was very important to me. Ultimately, um, I was trying to say I had really been on my way to China, but this was just around the time Nixon had opened China up, and it still wasn't possible to really get in. And so my interest was in Taoism, uh, even though I was studying physics and chemistry. Um, and so I did make some trips to the fringes of China, and in the process, met a Tai Chi master there that I studied with for a good while. And he really wanted me to move to Hong Kong and stay there and study with him. And that was a big temptation. That was another moment of where is this path of branching forks going to lead? But the dream material continued, and it felt like more and more of what I was doing needed to be to attend to that. I think the other thing was in doing science, I was very captivated by a lot of the ideas, the theoretical thought and the kind of precision and elegance. But I really missed the human dimension, working in a lab 10, 12 hours a day. Uh, there were maybe a couple of other people in the lab, but the human interaction was more minimal. And I knew friends who had pursued academic careers in the U.S. for professorships and so forth that had to work extremely long hours and often at the cost of marriages and friendships and everything else. And I just felt that wasn't the life that I really wanted to pursue. And the more I entered into it, I realized I needed to get some training in psychology to become a psychotherapist, and then ultimately that led me into the Jungian camp and analytic training.
What and how would you define adjacent possibilities?
Well, this is an idea that comes from out of the Santa Fe Institute, and it's the work of Stuart Kaufman. He's a theoretical biologist, and what Kaufman is doing is looking at innovative paths in evolution. For example, he takes biochemistry and the evolution, say, of proteins or sugars or what have you, and the way in which one set of molecules creates some possibilities for yet a further set of transformations, and it's become a general theory. There's a person in at the Sapienza University in Rome, Vittorio Loretta, who's really taken this as a physicist and looked at all kinds of cultural phenomena.
Hmm.
And what he does is he looks at innovation as a cultural transition to something new and personal novelty when something for ourselves personally. And he goes through the adjacent possible. He takes Kaufman's idea and shows how cultural ideas evolve. It's a kind of biological evolution on one hand, cultural evolution on the other hand, and this notion of the adjacent possible is a an important one. And Stephen Johnson is a science writer of some repute, and he's been writing about this. Where do good ideas come from? Is the title of one of his books on this. And what he points out is that there's the near possible, the adjacent possible, and then what he called the far possible. So if you look at somebody like Leonardo da Vinci, he's constructing submarines, tanks, helicopters, screw helicopters, but the technology around him is, mostly wood and leather and things like that. And there's no way to build what he's envisioning. And so it's so far possible. It's outside of the cultural capacities to do this, even though the visionary state is there. And, once in a while, we get somebody in the far possible who's really a kind of pioneer, a visionary that leads us
Mhm.
to a new kind of possibility. Obviously, one of the suggestions here is Jung. C.G. Jung might have been one of those kind of characters.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
So like let me this like layman exploration here, and I feel
sure, please.
so privileged to have this time with you and share it, especially because Miriam's going, for those that are listening or watching the YouTube, the Miriam's going in and out, so I personally get a little extra. Um, is the idea that all of those possibilities exist kind of currently, and they manifest within a time frame, but that time frame depends on a set of circumstances, and like is it sort of that, all the possibilities are currently exist, but they just are not they manifest in their time, or yeah, circumstances.
Or under when the circumstances are appropriate, they remain virtual, but
Okay.
they don't necessarily manifest. And this has had some major ramifications for things like quantum theory,
Yeah.
because the classic quantum theory, the Copenhagen solution, is that when you force a measurement, wave or particle, and then you set up an experiment and you force the electron to do one or the other, you collapse the wave function, it said, into one solution or the other solution. What the people working in the adjacent possible are saying, no, all of those virtual states remain. And in fact, there's now some experimental proof that you can actually push this a little bit one way or the other, if you can know how to vary the experimental conditions. So they're demonstrating all of this virtuality that's there.
Okay.
And this even works for multiple universes. I mean, one one argument is, well, the Big Bang itself, the kind of our current cosmology, is a collapsed state, but it doesn't mean that all the other virtual states wouldn't still be there.
Hmm.
And so it's a kind of opens the imagination up in a really profound way.
And that's what an individual human life exists in that same context. That so your dream was showing you a possibility, a waveform that that existed virtually that you could either realize or not realize
Yeah. I
in
would
that context.
say that yeah, dreams are often, you know, they seem like they're very close to the adjacent possible much of the time. That
Hmm.
they often are at the cutting edge of where we are developmentally. I mean, at least as a Jungian, that's what I look for in dreams. I mean, there are things that need to be worked through, but the working through generally is to unblock a logjam, to open up development, to move further, to help a person become as fully who they are as they can be.
Hmm.
And that is to begin to step into those other aspects of their personality.
I'm already entering many adjacent possibilities just as we talk and listen
Yeah.
to this. It is in sparking my imagination.
Good.
This is very great.
When you talked firstly about the enchantment in your dream, your face changed. I could just, it was like
Yeah.
almost what I perceived as joy. I can see it now. And then what I noticed is that you went into kind of like a sense making, how you made sense
Yeah.
of it in your life. So I've got a
Right.
two-part question. The first is the first is like I felt the fire that you described in the room, and I just wonder like what was this like what was the experience of the enchantment? Like what did it do to you um physiologically? Like how did it affect you in your life when you started to have these kind of dreams?
Yeah, they often the feeling is animation. There's a kind of an enlivening, an increase in vitality. This is actually something I'm very interested in because I think that's the more we become objectively focused and reductive scientifically oriented in our thinking and our cosmology, what have you, um, it gives us great precision, but at the cost of a kind of aliveness and recovering aliveness. I'm very interested in the use of language and communication more broadly for these kind of states of animation, because I think that's really what the enchanted world was and is about. What makes things come alive? Otherwise, we have a lot of ghosts on our hands.
And yeah, I know that feeling. And in that aliveness, how do you or what place does the second part, the sense making, the rational, like how do you like they're two strong components of your story, and where does the integration fit in your mind? Like how do they fit together?
Well, for me, the kind of meaning making understanding is implicitly there, but the articulation of it is always after the fact. This was something I learned fairly early on, that psychology is always after. You have an event and then you reflect on it. The reflection comes after, but it's an extremely important thing because it becomes a tool then that we can communicate and share with other people. So for me, yeah, I need both parts. The experience is very crucial, but being able to communicate it seems to me also essential. Otherwise, it's a kind of uh, autistic state that one's locked up in, even if it's a state of joy. So there is something about creating the tension, and I think the full richness of communication requires that we have access to both. I mean, certainly as a psychotherapist, that's part of what I listen to in people's language when they're talking, in a therapy session or something like that. They may have the right idea, they may have something very well understood, but it may not be yet animated for them. It may not truly have an emotional reality. So the old split from the Freudian world of primary and secondary process thinking is one that I think they need to be interwoven. Uh, and
Yeah.
there were some attempts to do that, but not many, not enough.
And and what's your experience of like how does that state of animation change the like we haven't talked about the field, I don't think, and this, how does that affect the field around people? Like what's its relationship to the field?
Well, the animating quality, one of its features is a kind of affective quality. So, in other words, you saw some joy as I entered into that, and that's a primary affect. And affect puts energy into the field. And I think this is part of what often happens in the disruptions with the internet. I mean, I have lots and lots of stories about this. I mean, I just was doing a group a couple of weeks ago, and somebody got to a point in a presentation where they sort of elided over the fact that they hadn't included something, there was something missing. And we slowed down. And just as we went to ask, that person's internet failed. Nobody else's did. There were a number of people on the call. Person got back on. And what we worked through was there was initially a feeling of shame around that there was a sense of failure, which ultimately, when we went more deeply into it, was not accurate. But these kinds of very intense affective charges impact and I would say disrupt the fields. And for some reason, and I don't have an answer to this one, why electronic fields seem to be vulnerable to these kind of affective states. But I'm certainly not alone in this observation. I mean, I've had many, many colleagues and many discussions with people, and I've got hundreds and hundreds of examples of these kinds of things. And the timing is exquisite. The moment in which, not everyone, I think one has to be careful not to misattribute meaning all the time, but there's often something significant that's happening when there's affect that's present and there's a disruption. So,
I,
for positive or
We,
negative,
we see the
excuse me.
same. I mean, I think we're moving towards a couple of the big topics here. Like we haven't really defined the unconscious field. So I want to get to that. And hopefully our
Sure.
editors do a great job of making this make sense for people that aren't present right now. Um, but you made me think of, so there's these giant, like the more complex the system is, the
Hmm.
more almost responsive it is to what's happening, to not responsive, but more possibilities for feedback into that field.
Yeah.
So like the electronic field, that you just blew my mind with that, because we've sort of continued to build a relationship with the electronic field where we can start to incorporate it rather than see it as an obstacle. But we do a lot of work in the um, wilderness settings where this
Hmm.
very thing happens all the time. So everything from an unexpected rainstorm coming at
Yes.
just the moment, or we had a recent experience where someone was talking about taking a major leap in their life and recognizing their ability to do that, and all of us, and there was a long pause, and a squirrel jumped from one branch, literally jumped from one branch to another while being chased by another one. And you could not have no human creativity, well, maybe some human creativity, but only rare human creativity could have orchestrated that event.
Yeah.
So that field, like we're talking about, that I think we're talking about these broader complex um, fields that are giving us feedback all the time,
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
and but we close off to them for some reason. Like maybe
Yeah.
that's the rationalization or the rational um, understanding of the world that says, no, this is what matters and not that. This subject or the objective truth matters, but not the whole subjective experience. Is that
Yeah, it's a very interesting question at multiple levels, including developmentally. You know, the psychoanalyst and developmentalist D.W. Winnicott, he was a famous child analyst and a beautiful writer, who wrote a lot about play and creativity, the imagination, what he called transitional objects and transitional, sort of experiences. Um, he has a place where he says it's the mother's job to protect the infant from too much coincidence. That's a stunning statement. It's like, what? What? Wait a minute. What was that? And when you sit with it, and yeah, the world of the infant is probably so enchanted and so magical that it's hard to sort out objective reality. And what he's saying is the mother's job is to help protect us early on so that we're not caught up in what can ultimately become a paranoid state where everything is magically linked and we can't tell what's happening. But then as we grow up, we get trapped in too much defense against those kind of coincidences and lose the capacity for meaning making that's there. That's why the notion of synchronicity seems to me to be so essential because it begins to find a pathway back in adult development to see and value these things and at least develop a kind of reflective function to work with these kind of serendipitous synchronistic experiences. And ultimately what I tried to do in some of my writing was to show that the indications here are these are about fields, that synchronicity is not just a concept of just spooky action at a distance, but there's a whole field concept that once you begin to get hold of that, you begin to see, oh, what looks like action at a distance is in fact field phenomena that are manifesting.
so? You talked in the course. You talked about. Let's see. I'm going to try to get this right, but you talked about the cosmology, the the current myth of of origin of the Big Bang
Yeah,
Theory,
sure.
and
Yeah,
the creation of time and space, and that Jung. I don't know if Jung added this or this is a later development, but that synchronicity originated at that moment of the Big Bang too, as
yeah,
another. Could you talk about that as a way into explaining what synchronicity is for the for those of us that might have heard that word a number of times, but don't understand the origin of the word and how it fits into a broader kind of academic or theoretical framework.
sure. Well, the idea was from Jung is that it was based on clinical observation that there were coincidences that seemed to be happening at times that were highly meaningful, and yet there couldn't be any causal um, sort of pathway to um, explain them and what to do with them. His paradigmatic case is he's got a woman who's very, very rational in analysis with him, and she's presenting a dream about about a beetle, a piece of jewelry she's given in the shape of a golden beetle. And at just that moment, he hears a tapping behind him, and he turns and opens the window, and in flies a rose chafer, a kind of beetle in Switzerland that's close to as scarab as possible. He catches it and says, "Here's your beetle." Um, and that he says that opened the analysis up. It broke through the rationality because she could see immediately in that experience that this was not understandable. And that happened probably in the about 1926, 1927. Um, and he doesn't use the concept of synchronicity yet. It takes him at least 2 more years to first get to the concept. And that's because what he's doing is he's working on his red book and he's doing a painting of a city like a mandala. And as he's in the middle of that, he receives through the mail a manuscript from a close friend of his, a guy named Richard Wilhelm, who's in Tsingtao, China. And it's a alchemical manuscript that Wilhelm has developed a friendship with a Taoist priest. And this priest has this rather old alchemical manuscript, and they've been translating it from Chinese into German. And he writes to Jung and says, "Would you be willing to, write a commentary or a foreword or something?" And Jung opens it up, and on the front page, he sees a picture that's very reminiscent of just what he's working on in his painting, and he's stunned. And a couple of months later, he's giving a seminar, and they have a series of coincidences, like we're talking about, that occur. And in the middle of that, the students say, "What's going on here?" And Jung says, "Well, in the West, we generally think in terms of cause and effect. That's our basic fundamental cosmological perspective. But in the East, they think of things falling together in time, things that are synchronous. And that's in November of 1928. That's the very first time he uses it. He doesn't develop it very much. He uses it once publicly at Wilhelm's memorial service in 1930, but it's really in 1932 when Wolfgang Pauli gets it, the famous physicist who becomes a Nobel Prize winning physicist, gets into analysis with Jung. And the two of them work on the relationship between physics and psychology. And they don't publish anything until the late 1940s. But by the late 1940s, they're working together on nature and psyche, and in a kind of a universal view that links them together. And this is where Jung writes his synchronicity hypothesis. In that, he says several really stunning things. One of them is that it's an act of creation in time, and it says it's before the laws of physics have come into being. It's as if it's an origin of creative action before the any of the laws of physics of cause and effect have taken place. Well, this is in the late 40s. Around 46, 47 is when the Big Bang Theory is first getting articulated. And if you look at that, what it says is at the beginning, this singularity, there are no laws of physics. They have not yet emerged. It takes a certain amount of time for those various kinds of physical forces to become differentiated out. And therefore, if you're saying synchronicities before the laws of physics, you're saying it's part of the singularity. You're saying it goes back. It's a, and the way we would understand it today, I think that it's not so terribly difficult to follow, is that um, cosmogony, the study of the origins of the universe, says there must have been asymmetries and local changes in density and so forth. Otherwise, nothing would have come into being. Everything would have canceled one another out. It couldn't have been just wholly random. There must have been folds and so forth in space time, and as particles emerged and so forth. And so, what the idea is that there's pattern forming that's preceding even the laws of physics. Well, that's what synchronicity is. It's a kind of a way of seeing things are connected by meaning in a pattern that would be without cause and effect. But if you say pattern forming is a fundamental property of the universe, that's not going to have a big pushback at this point. At the time when Jung framed synchronicity, of course, it would seem like a really radical hypothesis. So that's the way it enters in. And then the way the universe spreads out, space time, that's Einstein. And those are all field phenomena. So
And
we're getting into fields from that perspective.
let me I'm ready to go there and just check on one thing. Um, the let me form it. This is why we have an editor too.
Yeah,
Um, not as quick, not as bright.
it's okay.
Um,
Well, I know this material. I've been working on it for a long
so
time.
yeah, you're
It's
stretching my brain right now, our brains, and hopefully of people that listen. Um, so that so is it would it not be such a big stretch for people now because of quantum physics? Are those two things related, um, from your
you
perspective?
can yeah, you can see the kind of ontologies that are emerging from these things are beginning to they're beginning to intersect. More and more in if you study contemporary quantum dynamics, and I'm not anymore. It's been many years since I've done that, and there's been a lot of advances. So I'm an interested amateur. So I want to be careful about not overextending my expertise. But I do have quantum friends who work in the quantum world that really do this. And from what I can understand, the latest developments are looking at the way quantum effects can begin to enter the macro world. In other words, when I first learned it, it was this only happens at the most microscopic of levels. Once you get beyond atoms, or at least a small collection of atoms, you start losing some of that quantum. You get decoherence, and you get much more into what's ordinary, uh, our commonsensical kind of experience of nature. Um, there's now more ability to play with that, and so that things like entanglement become a significant kind of concept. For many years, I was always cautious about this because I think if you study the physics of it, it's not about metaphor; it's about observable kind of phenomena. And so to take that and then say, "Oh, that's a metaphor for the way the mind works," feels like, well, I can understand why it meets a certain curiosity, but it doesn't really address a mechanism that's realistic. But now that's starting to change. The notions are that, for example, with this, like I explained before about decoherence, the coherence decoherence being more flexible, that can be pushed, that virtual states exist, begins to open up the possibilities for things like entanglement becoming more a part of a kind of way in which the universe might work at multiple different levels. And so I think the sense is physics in its objective reality and psychology in its subjective reality beginning to find a place to interdigitate. The other
Hmm.
thing that where I found some of this is again to pick up the kind of interest in Buddhist meditation and so forth. In China, there was a school of Buddhism that got mixed in with Taoism, not surprisingly. And in particular, there's a school called Huayan, or Flower Garlands Buddhism. And this was during the Tang Dynasty around the 8th century AD, in the Common Era. And they began to do meditations that began to create a vision of the universe with very much structured by sunyata, or emptiness. And that picture that evolved out of those Buddhist meditations looks stunningly like the best contemporary visions we have of the universe at its largest scale, with these filamented galaxies, the strings of galaxies, and then open uh, space in between the dark matter making the filaments and the dark energy pushing things apart. Looks shockingly like something that was being articulated in the 8th and 9th century in China. And so the question is there something about the depths of subjective experience that intersects with objective experience, that maybe these realms are not as rigidly separated as we've been holding for the last 4 centuries or so.
Hmm.
And so that opens up then that physics and psychology may in fact be kindred spirits. They may really be talking about a kind of a fundamental world at base that ultimately differentiates itself into subjective and objective experience, but that this core connection remains in place.
Do,
In
do you believe that? Like, is that, I mean, I feel like that would be an act of faith that that's possible.
Yeah, it's a let me say it's a little bit of a leap of faith still for me.
Leap of faith.
It's the gap is narrowing as I get
Hmm.
older, in part because of all of I've gotten interested in things like cultural synchronicities, the way in which, events in the world seem to sometimes have these kind of coincidences between what's happening on the outside and what's happening internally. And to be honest, the view of the psyche I'm beginning to move towards is one that's more ecologically based. That is,
Hmm.
it's not so enskulled. When I first started to study this stuff, we still were talking about intrapsychic events and then maybe dyadic events, and you didn't go much further than that. I mean, Jung's collective unconscious got you a bit outside of that, but the contemporary world is looking, especially we feel like we've accelerated this with Zoom. All of
Yeah.
this kind of electronic communication has opened up the kind of interconnectedness, the ecological aspects of psyche that had not been highlighted so much before. I can find it. I can find pieces of it in the original depth psychological views. But I think that's an area where we're beginning to see, if that's accurate, uh, if these ecological models really do begin to broaden the way the psyche is in the world, then the objective and subjective are first order approximations. They're
I'm
not they're not the deeper reality.
uh,
Yeah.
Sure, Miriam.
I'm getting I'm like so excited. I mean, this is totally, I think, related to our work and our bias. But I hear, and you use 4 centuries, but I hear a movement between wanting to kind of like pass things apart. Like, what is this in its like disconnect so to understand? And I hear a movement in what you're
Yes.
describing that I think is mirrored in neuroscience too, of actually this movement towards actually looking at what's in between things, at the interconnection. And that from what you've said, the possibility of interconnection, once we see it in small instances, it's like, well, what if this is interconnected? What if that's interconnected? And I'm interested in how that relates to the kind of the field theory and that possibility of the expansion of how we view and see interconnection and experience it.
Yeah, well, that's two things. That is fundamental to what ecology is teaching us, just how profoundly interconnected things are. And I'll give some examples of that. Um, to and if nature is like that at so many different levels, then how can the psyche not be itself interconnected? I mean, we're part of nature. I don't see how we can evolve something that is completely separate from the way the rest of the world is. Um, and so, well, let me start there. This is a kind of rhizomatic model that I've been particularly interested in, and this starts. Jung actually talks about this. He doesn't have a lot, in 4 or 5 places, but he talks about this that life being like a rhizome. That and rhizomes are like bamboo and ginger and aspen trees, on and on. They're plant species that have underground root connections and have a lot of different what look like individuals showing up above ground, but all secretly part of a connected network under the surface, and that network feeds them all. That's what the rhizomal network is all about. And so if you've ever tried to tear up bamboo in your backyard, you'll know what I'm talking about. You get clumps where the root systems are highly interconnected. And this has been developed by a number of forest people, but in particular, I mentioned the work of Suzanne Simard. She's a forest botanist up in British Columbia, and she's done a tremendous amount of fascinating work on fir trees and now more gradually into whole forests. And thinking holistically is really a part of this, because when we start to look at these interconnections, we begin to realize that that reductive move to understanding the individual is powerful and valuable when we can do a lot of analysis, but it can blind us to the wholeness, the interconnectedness. And it turns out when things are interacting like this, they can produce wholes that have properties that are beyond any of the individuals. And that's the whole phenomenon of emergence and what are called superordinate systems. And we'll look at some of those. But for a moment, let me take you to the trees with the forest. She did a couple of things. She did an experiment to show how trees were able to grow from seedlings up to the forest canopy, because under the ground, the mother trees were feeding baby trees. She's got some elegant experiments to show the passage of sugar from a mother tree to the baby that couldn't photosynthesize. They couldn't make their own sugars because only about 4 or 5% of the light makes it from the top of the forest onto the forest floor. So that was a big mystery. How do these trees grow up? Well, it's through this secret underground connections. And then the piece of work that was really exquisite that she did was she began to look at the interconnection between trees and realized there were a series of what are called uh, mycorrhizal fungi. These are kinds of like a little bit like mushrooms, but they're fungi that they grow their roots into the trees, and there's an exchange, a symbiotic exchange. They're not parasitic. what they do is they're very good at getting minerals, and the trees aren't, and so the trees need minerals for their metabolism, but they're not photosynthetic, so they don't have much sugar. So they do a trade with the trees. It's a kind of an economy of the forest. But and that's the first level. But then when you start to go in more deeply, you realize no, that there's much more. That this is a whole communication network, this mycorrhizal network. So in other words, if a forest is being at the edge, beetle infestation is happening. Trees at the edge will that are being attacked by the beetles will give off signals, phytochemicals that they will send into the rhizal network, and that then distributes it to the other trees and gives it a warning. They change their biochemistry to become unpleasant to the beetles to help ward off the infestation. So they work as a community, an interconnected community, but you can't see it. I mean, she was discovering this in the 1990s. There's been now some very elegant writing on this. Richard Powers, his book The Overstory, is a particularly gripping novel about basically her research, showing this phenomenal connection. To go from there, in around 2010, there were some images from the largest scale pictures of the universe, and they showed a rhizomal structure. I mentioned that just briefly before, these kind of filaments. And in fact, 3 days after the first of those images came, somebody at MIT published a comparison of a mouse brain, a slice through a mouse brain, and the shape of the universe. And without scale, you couldn't tell the difference. You don't know which is which. They're fundamentally identical. Does that mean the universe is an intelligent brain? Well, that's beyond our capacity to say. But is that morphology part of the nature of life and part of the nature of the universe? Absolutely. So the rhizomal ecological perspective seems fundamental to the nature of the psyche. And so this is where we start to get into where synchronicity is something like a rhizomal field. You're seeing two parts that look like they're disconnected, but underneath there's this secret interaction that's part of what's causing the phenomena to occur. So that's the short course on an ecological view of the psyche that makes me think objective and subjective are not so split apart.
And it's an enchanting possibility too, even though
Yes.
I feel like in the language you're using and the way that you're talking about it and the images that you're presenting, I'm understanding what enchantment, what re-enchantment of the world is. We haven't
Yeah.
really said, you haven't defined that yet either, but just that
No.
possibility that there is this rhizomatic quality to life beyond the individual, beyond this planet, beyond our universe, and all the way down to the the neurological, the neurons in our brain, in each of our individual brains. It's enchanting listening to it. Um, how would you define then field theory when we're thinking about it from a human perspective, or the perspective of human experience, um, psychological, focusing on the psychological or beyond that, cultural even?
Yeah, sure. I mean that in our interactions with one another, which occur at so many different levels, from biochemical signals, pheromones, or whatever, to our sort of our behavioral language, the paraverbal material that we, from earliest infancy, we're interacting with others. We're always in a field of interaction. I mean, that the mind forms out of interactions with caretakers and the environment around those caretakers. I mean, there's really good evidence now that I was just reading this the other day that mothers who are pregnant reading a Dr. Seuss story out loud when their babies are born, those babies can distinguish that Dr. Seuss story from a different Dr. Seuss story. They prefer the one that they've heard in utero. In other words, we are establishing fields of interaction even before we're fully in the world, as we're part and parcel of, so it's still being in the mother's body. We've not yet fully separated out, but they're the interconnectedness and the environmental sort of expression of self is there from our origins. And I think that, of course, when we get up to language and our discussions like this one here, of course, there's a field of thought and language, very rich, cognitive, with emotion that's underneath, whether we're recognizing in one another the various kind of states that we can use, say, our mirror neurons to resonate with and feel and have a guess what might be going on in the mind of the other. I mean, we're humans are very complex organizations, and all these different layers of complexity create a holistic experience that I think far transcends only being a single individual disconnected from others in the environment. I think that that's one of the problems. We've gotten caught up in a kind of heroic genius myth that as our ideal, as our kind of cultural um, sort of destiny, the rugged individual, and so forth, and have lost the sense of how profoundly interconnected we are from in every moment of our life, all the way through to the end of life, and our relationship ultimately then to the universe. And we're just beginning to tap into this and beginning to understand that. I don't think we're anywhere near there. And this re-enchantment things that I'm talking about are probably something about perceiving the field, the enlivening aspects of the field, which to many indigenous populations, they saw and knew this. I mean, this isn't new. I mean, we're rediscovering. We've taken a journey through separating the subjective from the objective and kind of um, treating the subjective as mostly superstitious and of uh, little or no value. And now there's a kind of recovery and bringing it back. And in that recovery process, I think that's where the possibility of reenchantment starts to occur. It gets us back. We can't go back to what it was before. We're not going to live the lives of the indigenous peoples with their kind of relationship to nature. We're going to have to be who we are, but can we find a pathway in there that helps us feel much more deeply connected in that?
I, I keep saying that we're laymen, we're practitioners of organization, organizational
Sure.
development. So we end up working with a lot of people, a lot of different contexts, entering and exiting many different fields of cultural fields um, that are always moving and changing. Um,
Indeed.
and so all of our experience is very unscientific, but it aligns very much with what you're talking about in terms of the way that a group will travel, and one person's affect on a particular day or experience or even dream will enter into a group. We might even be working on something as sort of rational and objective as a business goal, but this is
Sure.
always present. And one of the things that we do, so I'm saying this by way of saying maybe it's not so far off, that reenchantment is help organizations and help leaders of those with more influence to to really bring that magical or enchanted space possibility into the day-to-day workings of what they're doing, and we and move away from that heroic model, which is actually, even for the heroes, is the heroes and heroines, is usually depleting,
Yeah.
right? And usually
Absolutely.
a burden, and and move towards a perspective that each of us, if we have a great idea, we start something great, we've inherited that from somewhere in the field as a gift, and it's our
Absolutely.
job to maybe manifest that, give it to others, allow others to enter into that possibility, and live it. So it's very simple, and it's happening everywhere, and I want to sort of align with you in that and say, I
Sure.
think that this is like in the difficulty of being a human in the world right now, more and more people, I think, are ready to take that leap into a more enchanted. There's nowhere to go except enchantment. It's kind of what I'm getting at. It's like otherwise you're just on one side of a falling apart. It feels like a falling apart, like falling apart experience. versus this sort of like enchantment into a new possibility. See if Miriam is, this is very, so how would you read this? Like if we were to step back from this experience of Miriam coming in and out, how would you, from a field perspective,
Well,
help us
yeah,
understand?
it's a good question. I mean, with these things, always when it happens, my first move is to make sure we don't move to blaming. That this isn't about somebody being problematic. It's something that's pushing to be uh, brought up into awareness. There's something that's struggling here to enter the field in some way. Um, and I've often found it as awkward and uncomfortable as these disruptions can be, they are about getting a voice in, and maybe it's something about the voice of the feminine here that's struggling to get in to be more grounded in a particular way. Um, I can think of several cases where um, communication had to go through this very elliptical pathway,
Mm-hmm.
and part of that is it's returning something that's been unaccepted, that there's not been a way to bring it in, to metabolize it, to understand it. And that even this very quality of winking in and out says something to us about there's something that's having trouble manifesting in some way. Do you think there's anything in your struggle to be able to join us that might be meaningful? Is this one question I had? Is this the voice of the feminine that's having a hard time manifesting in one way or another?
Wow, that's a really big question. I actually have, it's interesting sitting in a lot of conversations and um yeah, that's such a big question because I think that part of my experience having done a lot of work in with women and then also sitting in a lot of um situations with men is I think that that enchantment, that aliveness, not necessarily always coming as joy, but a fullness of feeling that
Hmm.
I have felt more
Yes.
invited in circles of women to come um, in certain situations, like in situations where it's like there's something that's defined and we're defining something or we're having a conversation that has a certain expertise around it. I'll often feel like I'm interrupting with my, like, if I let myself lead from, and I don't know whether it's particularly feminine, but it feels like a wave. Oh, I feel this wave. I
Hmm.
feel for me, it's an excitement, or I feel a wave of something. I'll often
Sure.
feel like, oh, should I contain it or should I restrict it? And I don't know.
Mm.
It's interesting to think about that in terms of the interconnection that we were talking before, like the interconnection between the kind of the wave and then riding the wave. Um, and I can only kind of describe it in a, like, you can see me starting to use my hands now in a way that it feels like, it feels like you're
Hmm.
riding something. And they're two different energies. And I've certainly been exploring that much more in my work and in my life about letting myself, like, letting that wave come out. um, and I don't know how that relates to field theory or to your work, but I think the point that I got really excited was when I could feel the enchantment and I could sense the enchantment and I wanted to kind of like ride that.
Hmm.
And it's so interesting that now Adam's gone offline, like just went offline for that bit. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. I mean, we could read so much into all of that. So I don't know whether that's an answer. I could go into the theory of it and definitions of the masculine energies and the feminine energies, but I definitely feel like there's a wanting to integrate those things. And just one last part to the story was we were just on the nature retreat, the squirrel story that Adam just told was a one of some of our work in nature, and it was mostly men. For the first time, I would say it was mostly men there,
Mm,
and it,
mm,
and it was after many circles online with men, and for the first time in a long time in myself, it didn't feel abrasive to be in that form, in that circle of men. And I felt a greater sense of
mhm.
integration than I felt in a long time, which
Oh,
probably says something about me, but maybe it also says something about the field. And maybe it also says something about what I would describe is the wave that we're riding in the world. So I don't know. That's my little monologue,
yeah,
having
yeah.
been pulled offline now by the internet.
Yeah, it's how to get these voices all together, and you know the richness and the complexity. This is some of what we're struggling with here is how to really enhance that. So, for example, all three of us could be part of the discussion simultaneously. Um, I'm glad to have you. This is the longest period I've seen you on today. It seems like there's something in your speaking that's stabilizing your presence.
Now Adam's gone offline again. It's so interesting, isn't it? Um,
I'm here.
Joe, I'm
Uh,
wondering if I could ask you
I'm
a
just waiting.
question. I'm wondering if having not listened to everything, but I'm wondering if and again, if you've already talked about this, but I'm so curious. Like, there's a certain freedom in ending, your tenure as president at Pacifica, and there was a certain passion that I felt in you for this body of work, like the possibilities of what if that these two disciplines, like in your life, you know, two disciplines
yes.
in your life, what if they were intersecting? And I'm wondering if this is something that you're continuing your exploration of, as you kind of enter into this new phase of your life and work.
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of the reason that I decided to retire at this point was um, I felt that the administrative work, as valuable as it was, and I worked on building a what I would call a complex adaptive system in terms of empowering people to really take ownership of their areas of responsibility and expertise. When I first got there, the organization was very flat, and the president made most of all the decisions. And I realized that wasn't an optimal solution. So we worked to really build a system that had enhanced complexity with each person taking up the areas where they were skillful and really being able to propose and to build and to consider how to go forward. And through that project, I feel like I've reached the place where the system is starting to function that way. And my energies were absorbed into administrative work to make that happen.
Do
Now,
you feel the re-enchantment when you enter the field of doing the work on re-enchantment, which I imagine is somewhat academic? Do you feel the re-enchantment? Like, do you do the work on dreams? Do you do practices to put you in that space? How do you do the work of re-enchantment? Um,
yeah, I think it's linked again to holistic experiences in part. And I don't think I can author them in the sense of going out and making it happen, just like I don't make synchronicities happen. I think there's a way of enhancing one's perceptual capacity, learning to open the heart, as it were, to these phenomena, and kind of watching for. I like to watch things at a sort of subtler level when they're first beginning to emerge and coming to appreciate them more. And it seems like cultivating that it's part of the process. It's slow and, from a conscious perspective, episodic is what I would say. I have moments where it happens and it's very powerful, and then things feel kind of ordinary and flat for a while. And but I keep working, and then it's entering into certain kind of moments where these things just start to unfold, and kind of knowing what are the signals. I wrote a paper once early on about, I called it Towards the Feeling of Emergence, which is linked to this. And it really was like, how do I know something new is starting to emerge, that something is beginning to constellate in a therapy session? And that is about enchantment. And it was the capacity for the feeling of surprise. And so the use of curiosity, to being curious, oh, like, what do you know? What's going on here? You know, that often is a part of opening the door to then other phenomena that happen. And, it's like we have this curious thing about the internet today. I mean, I'm fascinated. I don't really know. I can't really explain it. I can sort of watch and go, this is amazing. What it might mean.
Well,
And
it's yeah, and it's like don't
please.
like I really got that lesson from how you interacted with my internet issue today is like don't dismiss things you might be able to actually easily explain in a like, oh well, the internet is not working, therefore we'll dismiss that. But don't dismiss
Yeah.
the interruptions, don't dismiss the interruptions to the plan is kind of like what I got from your interactions today. Let them, like, be curious, dwell in them. And is that, that sounds to me like that similar kind of like in working with re-enchantment. It's even if you're not in the space of the dream, like the massive experience of like this dream that comes in and hits you, it's in those other periods, it's like not dismissing events that come in and disrupt, your schedule or your plan or whatever it
Yes.
might be. It
Yeah. The
it
things
seems
that,
like one last reflection. Sorry.
sure, please
Oh, I was going to say it seems
go ahead.
very, very significant that your time as president at Pacifica was full of such disruptions,
Oh my God.
given our
I had
conversation.
no idea what I was going to happen to me. I mean, it started, when I was appointed president, the board and the the previous president and family said, "Let's do a ritual. What should we do?" And so I said, "Well, how about the four elements?" Just seemed so. We did fire, passing the torch, uh, earth, air, and water. 3 months later, the Thomas fire broke out. That we had fire within a quarter mile of us. We had to evacuate the campus, 4 times in the month of December of 2017. Um, and then in January of 2018, a month later, the Montecito debris flow, we had this huge rainstorm come in, and all this water, the reservoir broke, and all of this water came flooding down. Terrible devastation. Uh, Closed the campuses for the upper campus for 3 months, and the lower campus for a couple of weeks. We were trapped in Carpinteria. We couldn't get out north or south. All the roads were severed by the debris from the water flow. And then, uh, as we're finally recovering from all of that, the pandemic hits. And we've been in this kind of move into the remote world, because Pacifica was not a remote school. A bit of, they had a couple of programs that did part of their work remote, but most of it was all on campus. And so we went within 3 days from being a residential school to being a remote school. And that pivot was a phenomena in and of itself to watch. And again, there's no way I could have predicted that, but it carried me into looking at how and why did this pandemic arise? Where was it coming from? And sure enough, there's very good evidence that it's linked to global warming, that it's partly human driven, and that the way it's happening is it's happening at a local level and then it becomes global. And it's so much a part of the metaphor that we're working on here in terms of, the elements and this rhizomatic structure. I mean, the elements were the rhizomes, by the way. In the ancient Greek world, this is Empedocles. He talks about four rhizomes: earth, air, fire, and water. So that rhizomatic reality keeps manifesting itself in some rather remarkable ways. I don't think it's over just because I've retired. I just hope that going forward, its expressions are a little softer.
All right. Thank you so
Okay,
much. We appreciate it.
okay, very good,
Bye.
Adam. Uh, yeah, it was a pleasure and an unusual one,
An
but a
unusual
pleasure.
pleasure. Here's to more of those.